Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. We've been talking about games that use text input, where the player enters a command saying what they want to do rather than clicking on links, and I want to continue doing that in this video. In particular, we're going to be talking about the use command, which is a sort of general command for making use of items in the game, and also about how the use command is not enough in itself and how you will probably need other more specific commands. So we start in the southwest corner of the mansion, as we have been doing. Let's go north. We see the key lot just sort of lying in the room as it has been. We get the key, we go east, we see that there is a door in the north wall. We try to go through it and discover that it's locked, and we think, oh, I have a key, so why don't I use the key? And we find that using the key seems to unlock the door, and therefore that we can go north and escape the mansion and win the game. So let's have a look at the code that allowed that to happen. But before we do that, let's say we do exactly the same thing, except that when we get the key, because let's say we're not used to the conventions of games like this, and we don't know that use is a really common term, and because there's no sort of help file or anything in the game yet, let's say we say unlock the door. Well, we find that that actually works as well, and so once again we can go through the door and win the game. So okay, let's look at the code. Now you'll see first of all that I've rearranged things. It was a little bit big to use it just fits in the screen on this monitor using the most zoomed in zoom, but it didn't do so in my other computer. So I zoomed it out, and I've also rearranged things to make the flow of the game more clear, to make it more clear that the way the game works is quite simple, although there's lots of individual pages. It has a fairly simple structure, which is that it's set up, the player gets a description of what's happening, where they are, and they enter a command based on that. The computer extracts the most relevant information out of that, tries to find a command in there. Based on that, it might go back to input if it can't, or it might go to one of several screens, each of which is, or several pages, each of which is specific to a type of command. Some of those go to second pages, and once it's processed the command and made whatever changes are necessary, it always ends up looping back to the input, where the player gets an updated description of what's happening, and then they enter another command, and the loop begins again until the game is over. Also, you notice that there's a couple of occasions where two different commands have to do the same thing, and so instead of repeating the same code twice, I've put the code in its own page, and then I use an include command in the two pages that use it to refer to it, to save on having to type the same code two or more times, and also meaning that if I update the code, I only have to do so in one place. So let's have a look at use. That's what we're going to be spending most of the rest of the video doing. But before we do that, if you're familiar with games like this, you would probably have picked up that use is always going to work. Right? At least it might not work in the sense that it might not win you the game, but at least the computer is going to know what you're trying to do. So if you say use use key or use gun or whatever it may be, that's gonna be recognised by the computer. But if you're not familiar with the conventions of this game, and also if you are playing a game that doesn't have a sort of help file, a file that tells you what are some common commands that you can use, which this one doesn't yet have, or if it does have a file like that, but it's not obvious how to get the information in that file, or if it does have that sort of a help file and it is obvious how to get the information in the file, but you just sort of plough ahead, which some people will always do. They want to just try out the game and they won't start by reading the documentation. They'll sort of read it if they get into trouble or if they can't work out what to do. In any of those circumstances, you might not type use. You might type a more natural sounding sort of command, a more specific command. So you might say unlock door if you were trying to use the key. You might say shoot gun or pull gun, draw gun or something like that. If you were, if there was a gun item that you wanted to use, you might say throw tennis ball, whatever. And so it's always a good idea, as well as having a use command, it's always a good idea to think about what other ways the player might use to express that idea. In other words, what are the sort of more specific words that a player might use to indicate that they want to manipulate a particular feature of the game? And so in this particular case, I thought of unlock. And the way that I coded unlock is very simple, because in this particular game there's only one key and only one door, so we don't have to have a sort of general system. All I did, let's get into that, is, now you'll remember if you've been following these videos, you'll know that $X is the player's input. On the input screen, the player will enter a series of characters, and the computer will store that series of characters in the variable $X. So all I've done is that if the computer picks up unlock as the command that the player is using, we just set X to equal use key, and then we include process action, which is this one, and then it'll process it again, and it'll see use, and then it'll go to use. So it's that simple. You don't have to have separate code in here for manipulating the door. You just treat unlock as meaning the player means use key, and then just go back to process action. And so if you had, let's say there was a gun in the game, and you had a page that was shoot, you would probably just go, all right, set X equal to use gun, and then go to process action. But do that, because it's not fun to not progress because the computer doesn't recognize something you've entered and it's quite a sensible thing, right? It's not at all sort of perverse or unlikely that you'd think unlock the door would be the way that you would express your desire to do that particular action in the game. So it can be fun to not progress because you can't work out what the puzzle is. I mean, depending on how long you are frustrated and how much hope you have that you're going to work it out. But being frustrated because you've entered a perfectly reasonable command and the computer, whoever programmed the computer, just didn't think of it, that's not fun. And it's kind of inevitable because you can enter anything, and there's always going to be something that you don't think of. But you probably want to, in games like this, you probably want to minimize the possibility of that as much as possible. And so if you can think of another word that someone can use, I would suggest have it as one of the commands that the computer can recognize, and just have some sort of simple code to change X to be use something. Usually it'll be use something, and then just go back to process that new string. All right, so let's go on to use. So the computer has recognised that the player has entered use, either because they did enter use or because they entered unlock and then the computer changed it. But either way, the next question is, what item do they want to use? Well, there's only one item in the game, so in this case it's probably going to be key. But of course, in a finished game, there would be multiple items. And also, it's not clear whether the player has that item. So we need to work out a couple of things first. First of all, we need to say, has the player specified an item? And if so, which one? And then, if they have specified an item, we need to make sure they have that item. So the first thing we need to do is included in this include, no pun intended, include find item in text. And that does, I've already shown you this code, although it's in a new page, but I'll go through it briefly again. It will return the variable y, and y will be either 0 if the computer can't find an item, or it will be a number if the computer can find an item. It will be the number of the item. It'll be the number that the item has in the $I array at the beginning of the game, which is this one here. And so it goes through all of the items, and if it finds the short name or the short description of an item in the text of $X, which is the player input, then it sets y to be equal to the number of that item. And if it never does that, then y will stay as 0. If you want more detail about that, you'd need to look at the previous videos where I dealt with that code initially. All right, so we return from that include, and if y is 0, in other words, it can't find any item that is being referred to, then it says, well, it gives essentially an error message. I can't do that sort of a message, and we go back to input, and the player has to enter something else. Otherwise, this code happens, and this is very similar. We are now trying to find item in inventory, and that's this other subroutine, other page here that we get with an include. So we set W to 0. This time W is the number of the slot in the player's inventory. You'll remember that $B is the array indicating what the player is carrying, if anything, and each slot is either 0 or a number. So we set W to 0. We go through every number from 1 to M, which is the maximum number of items that the player can carry, currently set to 4. And if the Zth slot in item B is equal to $Y, which is the item we're looking for, then we set W equal to the number that we're currently on. In other words, we say, right, the item that we want is in slot whatever $W is set to. And if we can't find the item, then W will still be 0. And once again, I've already gone through that code when we were dealing with dropping items. If you want to look at these two bits of code in more detail, because what I said didn't sort of explain it fully to you, look at the video about dropping items, because that deals with both of those areas of code, although I hadn't yet moved them to their own pages. So where are we? We're in use. So we go to find item in inventory, and once again, if we can't find that item, we give an error message, or we go to use to, and use to is going to be the various ways in which we can use items. Now, at the moment, there's already there's only one, so it's relatively simple. and that is if the location is 3, or if $L, which is the location, is equal to 3, and $Y, which is the item, is equal to 1. In other words, if we're trying to use the key in the northeast corner of the mansion, then something will happen based on $U. Now you'll remember that $U is a special variable to do with whether the door is locked or unlocked. If U is already equal to 2, which is to say the door is already unlocked, then it gives essentially an error message. It says, well, the door's already unlocked. There's no need to sort of unlock it again. Otherwise, it'll say you use the key to unlock the door. It will change the array to do with connections such that $P31 is equal to 5. And what that means is that the room number 3, if you go north, you end up in room or area number 5, which is outside the mansion, and that gives you the message that you've won, because we're sort of pretending that getting out of the mansion is the aim of the game at the moment. So it'll re-establish that connection, and it will set U equal to 2. In other words, it will it'll set a variable that reminds it that the door is unlocked. And either way, we've either changed something about the game state or we haven't, and we've just created a message saying that we sort of can't do anything extra. Then we go back to input, as everything else does. It goes back to input. Now, so that's all what happens if L is equal to 3 and Y is equal to 1. And then it says else, what do you want to use, which is a sort of error message saying, look, I can't work out exactly what you're trying to do, or at least what you're trying to do doesn't have any effect in the game. Now, as the game progresses and grows, there will of course be lots of other cases. So it'll be stuff like, else if the location is 1 and the item that you're trying to use is item number 3, well then that will cause that'll be trying to open the set of drawers, but unfortunately the set of drawers has got a poison trap or something, and you spring it and you die, or something like that. Whatever other item uses we come up with. It's quite code intensive. It sort of feels like there should be, that's quite a lot of code for just one action. If you imagine that multiplied by every possible action that could be in a game of reasonable size, this is going to be a really big page. And I think that's kind of unavoidable because having lots of things that can happen, having lots of buttons to push and lots of effects that the player can have, some of which progress the game and some of which are just sort of fun little Easter eggs, is a big part of the interest in this game, right? You want to have fairly hard puzzles, and we don't. Right at the moment we don't have a hard puzzle. We just have the very minimum kind of setup to be a game like this. But you want to have hard puzzles, and that means lots of different possibilities that you can try, right? It's kind of like an escape room in a little bit, in the sense that if you're in an escape room and there's one thing you've obviously got to do, it's not much of an escape room. What you want is to think, well, there's 5 or 6 different, gee, what am I supposed to do? There's 5 or 6 different things I could do. And sort of 4 of them are either going to sort of, in the context of a game, are either going to kill you, or at least are just going to give you a message that no, that's not what you're supposed to do. So you want to have lots of red herrings and lots of sort of booby traps. And you want to have the correct path being fairly complicated as well. So, and there's probably not going to be an obvious way that you can. Some of the commands you'll be able to deal with sort of more than one room in the same bit of code, but a lot of them are going to be specific to, if you use a specific item in a specific room, you get a specific message. So what I'm saying, quite long-windedly, is that this page is going to have a lot of fiddly little code, and I don't think there's a way to avoid that, which is we're going to sort of try and minimize it and sort of combine things as much as possible, but it is a sort of unavoidable feature of what makes games like this interesting, that there's lots and lots of different little possibilities that can happen. But anyway, that is an introduction to use, with the caveat that we should try and think of other ways that the player might try and express what they're doing, and we should try and deal with that, and that we can deal with that in a fairly simple way just by changing $X, changing the input. What we're going to work on in future videos is making the game more of a game. Now that we've got the basic structure of a game, where we've got we haven't dealt with characters yet, but we will deal with that in the future. But we've got the very basic structure of a game, which is you can move around, there are items, you can pick up and drop the items, and you can use the items. That's really the minimum that you need for a game of this type. Now we've got that skeleton, let's try and make it an actual interesting puzzle. So that's sort of what we'll be looking at in future videos in this series. So I hope that's useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.